A cold rain was falling on the slopes of Mount Trocchio on the 2nd of March, 1944. The acting Major General commanding the 2nd New Zealand Division, Howard Kippenberger, had come up the mountain that morning to study the German positions across the valley. He had been on the ridge the day before. He took one wrong step on a path that had already been walked by other men and stepped on a small German anti-personnel mine no larger than a paperback book. The mine was made almost entirely of wood. The American mine detectors that had swept those slopes had heard nothing in their headphones. Kippenberger lost both feet that morning, one severed in the blast, the other amputated by the surgeons of the 2nd New Zealand Field Hospital below the knee. That mine was called the Schutzen Mine 42. By the spring of 1944, weapons like it had spread across every front the Allies were fighting on. They were the leading edge of a deliberate German program to make the very ground of Europe lethal to anyone who tried to cross it. The men whose job it was to find those mines were the engineers of the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and a handful of British, Canadian, Polish, and New Zealand sappers fighting alongside them. They walked into a continent that the Germans had filled with mines that could not be seen, could not be heard, and could not, by the standard tools of the day, be detected. And then, by sweat and by science and by stubborn courage, they found a way to beat them. The landmine was not a new weapon. Armies had buried explosive charges to stop horses and men since at least the American Civil War. But what the German army did between 1942 and 1944 was something different in scale and in cunning. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, given command of the Atlantic Wall in late 1943, became its loudest advocate. He had fought the Allies in North Africa. He had seen what their tanks and their trucks and their endless supply columns could do once they got moving. His answer was to stop them before they could move at all. He wanted, by his own account, 50 million mines along the western coast of Europe. He wanted anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, anti-paratroop mines, mines that could sink ships, and mines that could sink landing craft. He did not get 50 million. He got something close to 6.5 million. By the 30th of May, 1944, just 1 week before the Normandy invasion, German engineers had laid more than 6.5 million mines in the West. That figure comes from a contemporary report associated with Vice Admiral Friedrich Ruge, who served on Rommel's staff. 5 million of those mines were planted along the Atlantic Wall itself. Along the Channel beaches alone, there were more than 500,000 foreshore obstacles by the middle of May, and 31,000 of those obstacles were fitted with mines. Behind the beaches, in the meadows, the Germans flooded on purpose. In the bocage hedgerows, where every gateway was a killing ground, the Wehrmacht had turned the soil itself into a weapon. But the truly dangerous innovation was not the number of mines. It was their composition. By 1942, the Germans had learned that the Americans and the British were beginning to field a new kind of tool, an electromagnetic mine detector that could sense the iron in a buried anti-tank mine through several inches of earth. The German answer was to take the metal out of the mine. The Schutzen Mine 42, known to every Allied soldier as the shoe mine, was the most common of these new weapons. It was a small wooden box about 5 inches by 4 inches by 3 inches, with a hinged lid held closed by a thin wire latch. Inside sat 200 grams of trinitrotoluene and a simple pull igniter. The only metal in the entire device was the striker pin and a small spring, weighing only a few grams together. It cost the German war economy almost nothing to make. A village carpenter could turn out 100 boxes a day. The mine took anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds of pressure on the lid to drive the striker pin into the detonator, which was roughly the weight of a man's stride. It was designed to wound rather than kill, on the cold logic that a wounded American required 2 more Americans to carry him off the line, while a dead American required none. There was a second mine in the same family, larger and more terrible. The Holz Mine 42, the Wooden Mine 42, was an anti-tank weapon. It was a wooden crate filled with 5.4 kilograms of amatol explosive, waterproofed with bitumen. It took the weight of a tank track or a heavy truck wheel to set off, but when it did, it could blow the road wheel off a Sherman or break the back of a half-track. The Germans manufactured them in the millions. By the time the Allies invaded Italy, hundreds of thousands of Holz mines were in the ground. Then, in 1943, came the Glasmin 43. It was a shallow glass bowl, 6 inches across, looking very much like an ordinary kitchen mixing dish, with a small charge of explosive inside and a glass pressure plate on top. There was no metal in it at all. Not in the body, not in the fuse, not in the trigger. The Germans produced 11 millions of these glass mines in 1944 and 1945. Almost 10 million were still sitting in their crates, undeployed, when the war ended. The Glasmin had a particular cruelty beyond its detectability. When it exploded, it did not just shatter the foot of the man who stepped on it. It drove glass shrapnel deep into his flesh, glass that did not show up on the X-ray plates of the field hospitals, glass that surgeons had to find by touch and by guesswork. There was a fourth mine in the family. The Topf mine, the pot mine, was an anti-tank charge made of compressed wood pulp, cardboard, tar paper, and small glass plugs. It contained almost 6 kilograms of explosive. It began entering service in late 1944 and was first encountered in combat in early 1945. To allow German engineers to find their own buried mines, the Germans coated the surface of each Topf mine with a special sand they called Tarnsand. That sand was mildly radioactive. The German device, built to locate the Tarnsand coating, the Stuttgart 43, used a Geiger-Müller tube. The Allies would not understand the radioactive trick until after the war. By then, it would not matter. They had already found another way. This was the world the men of the United States Army Corps of Engineers walked into. They were the smallest of the combat arms. They were not glamorous. They did not appear on the recruiting posters with a rifle on their shoulder and a fierce expression on their face. They built bridges. They blew up bridges. They cleared rubble and laid wire and built airstrips and erected the long pipelines that carried gasoline across France. And in the mine warfare of 1944, they were the men who walked first. Their primary tool, at the start of 1944, was a device called the Detector Set Anti-Tank Mine Portable SCR-625. It had been developed at the Camp Evans Signal Laboratory in Wall Township, New Jersey, an outstation of the Fort Monmouth Signal Complex on the New Jersey shore. The SCR-625 was first sent into combat during Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa, in November 1942. By the time the Italian campaign opened, it was the standard mine detector of every American engineer battalion. It was a brilliant piece of engineering for the time. The search head and rod assembly weighed only 7.5 pounds. It used 3 coils of wire, balanced electrically against one another, mounted inside a wooden disc the size of a dinner plate at the end of a long wooden rod. When the disc was held a few inches above the ground and any piece of metal entered the electromagnetic field, the balance was upset, and a steady tone in the operator's headphones changed pitch. A trained sapper could find a German telemine, the standard anti-tank mine, at a depth of 6 to 12 inches. Tens of thousands of SCR-625 sets were produced. They saved many lives. But the design had a fatal flaw, and it was not the engineer's fault. The SCR-625 could only sense metal. Wood, glass, cardboard, ceramic, tar paper, all of these were invisible to it. The mines that began arriving in Italy in 1943, the shoe mines and the Holz mines, were precisely engineered to live below the threshold of what the detector could hear. The few grams of striker spring inside a shoe mine were not enough to register against the background hum of iron oxides in volcanic Italian soil. The official history of the Corps of Engineers, written after the war, put it plainly. With the increasing number of non-metallic enemy mines, the standard detector became less dependable, and the steel prod, pushed by hand into the dirt at a careful angle, became the surer tool. There is a name in this story that deserves to be spoken before we go any further. The original electromagnetic mine detector, the grandfather of the SCR-625 and of every metal detector built since, was the work of a Polish lieutenant named Józef Stanisław Kosacki. He had escaped Poland after the German invasion in 1939, was interned in Hungary, broke out in December of that year, made his way through France, and arrived in Britain in June 1940. By late 1941, he was at the Polish Army Communications Training Centre at St Andrews, in Scotland. Working with another Polish soldier, Sergeant Andrzej Garbosz, Kosacki built the first practical portable mine detector in early 1942. He gave the design to the British Ministry of Supply for nothing. He never patented it. He received a personal letter of thanks from King George VI. About 500 of his detectors were rushed to El Alamein in October 1942 and helped clear the German minefields ahead of Montgomery's 8th Army. More than 100,000 of his Mark I sets were eventually built. Several 100,000 more of the later marks followed. The Polish mine detector remained in British military service into the 1990s. The SCR-625 was the American cousin of Kosaki's invention. Without him, the Allied armies of 1944 would have been blind, even to metal mines. By the end of 1943, with the Italian campaign grinding through one mountain mass after another, the limits of the existing detector were obvious to every man on the line. The Germans had built a defensive system called the Gustav Line, anchored on Monte Cassino, and they had filled the approaches to it with mines of every kind. Tens of thousands of mines were laid along the Garigliano sector alone. The Shoe, the Stock, the Regal, the Telemine, the Bouncing S-Mine, all mixed together in patterns the German engineers recorded with bureaucratic precision, and the Allied sappers had to discover one painful step at a time. The terrain made everything worse. Italy in winter is not the postcard country of summer. It is a place of half-frozen mud, of stones that look like nothing in particular, of mule paths that wind up through olive groves where every flat patch of ground might or might not be a place a man could stop. The Apennines forced the Allied armies to fight their way uphill, on foot, through mountains the Germans had been preparing for months. There was no way around. A road blown by a German engineer was a road that took an Allied engineer days to repair, sometimes weeks, and every yard of that road had to be cleared of mines before the trucks could come up. Kippenberger's loss on Mount Trocchio was one moment in a long winter of those losses. On the 22nd of January, 1944, 36,000 American and British soldiers landed at Anzio, 50 miles behind the Gustav Line. The plan was a quick run to Rome. The reality was 4 months in a flat and exposed beachhead, ringed by German artillery on the Alban Hills, and laced through with mines on every dirt track and every farm lane. The 36th Engineer Combat Regiment was committed to the line as infantry, holding 5,600 yards of front along the Moleta River for 45 days through February and March, with only 2,150 men. The 39th Engineer Combat Regiment held the right flank of the entire beachhead. They fought with the rifles of dead men because they did not have enough of their own. In the early hours of the 26th of January, in the middle of a gale, the American landing ship LS-T-422 was at anchor off the beachhead, carrying Companies C and D and the headquarters company of the 83rd Chemical Mortar Battalion, along with elements of the 68th Coast Artillery Regiment. She dragged her anchor in the wind and drifted into a German minefield. At about 5:20 in the morning, she struck a moored mine that ignited her cargo of fuel and ammunition. Hundreds of men died that day, including 59 soldiers from across Pennsylvania, whose names are now memorialized at the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, many of them on the tablets of the missing because their bodies were never recovered. Inside the Anzio perimeter, a platoon of the 109th Engineer Combat Battalion spent 240 man-hours in a single April day, planting 2,444 anti-tank mines of their own to stop a German counterattack that everyone expected, and that almost broke through. American engineers were dying at a rate that nobody back home would ever fully see. They worked at night, mostly, because daylight on the Anzio beachhead meant German artillery from the Alban Hills, and they slept by day in dugouts cut into the sandy soil, never far from the mines they had laid themselves. In early January, on the slopes of Mount Porcia, Task Force Allen, built around the 6th Armoured Infantry Regiment, with the 48th Engineer Combat Battalion attached as infantry, fought for the high ground. The task force lost 66 men, killed, and 379 wounded, in roughly 10 days of combat. On the night of the 7th of January, on Mount Porcia, a sergeant of Company C of the 48th named Joe C. Specker volunteered to take a machine gun forward alone against a German machine gun nest that was holding up his company's advance. He climbed the slope under fire with his weapon and a box of ammunition. He was severely wounded as he climbed, but he dragged himself onward over the rocks, set up his gun, silenced the enemy nest, and drove off the snipers covering it. He was found dead at his gun the next morning. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first awarded to a combat engineer in the Second World War. He was 22 years old. The official history of the Corps in Italy is unsparing. Approaching the Volturno, it says, the Allies had run into increasingly dense and systematic minefields, which included unfamiliar varieties of mines and booby traps. The German mine arsenal in Italy contained the bouncing S mine and the Teller mine, plus many new types, including the shoe and the stock, mines with detonations delayed up to 21 days, and mines with improvised charges. Non-metallic materials such as wood and concrete in many of the newer mines made detection more difficult and more dangerous. Allied troops dreaded the shoe mine especially. The shoe did not kill, but as little as 5 pounds of pressure would set it off to shatter foot, ankle, and shin bones. That last sentence is the heart of it. 5 pounds. The weight of a small child. The weight of a curious dog. The weight of a man taking a single step in the wrong place. The American engineers in Italy did 3 things in the early months of 1944 that began, slowly, to turn the problem around. The first was the simplest. They put down their detectors, and they picked up a thin steel rod or a sharpened bayonet, and they began to prod the ground by hand, an inch at a time, on their bellies in the mud, holding the prod at an angle of 30 degrees, so that if it struck the top of a buried mine, it would slide off the pressure plate instead of triggering the fuse. It was the slowest possible way to clear a path. It was also, in soil thick with iron and with shrapnel and with the broken metal of 2 years of fighting, the only way that worked. The second thing the engineers did was to set up countermine schools at the level of the Field Army. Fifth Army established its school in southern Italy. First Army would soon set up its own in England. Captured German mines of every type were collected, disassembled, photographed, and laid out on tables for new arrivals to handle and to learn. Officers and non-commissioned officers came down from the line for a week at a time to study mine patterns, fuse types, booby trap signatures, and small unit clearance drills. The school taught a discipline that no manual could fully convey, the discipline of moving slowly when every instinct is shouting at you to run. The third thing was to begin recording every minefield, friendly and enemy, on a single map maintained at Army headquarters. The Germans had been doing this from the beginning of the war. The Americans, during the first phases of the Italian campaign, had not. Engineer units laid friendly minefields, moved on, and forgot to leave detailed sketches behind. New units coming up the line walked into their own predecessors' fields and were killed by their own side's mines. By the spring of 1944, this was changing. But none of this was enough on its own. The men were dying faster than they could be replaced. The mines could be laid faster than they could be lifted. What was needed was a tool that could see through wood and glass and cardboard, a tool that could find a shoe mine before a soldier's boot did. And that tool, in the spring of 1944, was about to arrive. It came from a federal office in Washington, D.C., run by an MIT-trained electrical engineer named Vannevar Bush. Bush was the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, the wartime agency that channeled American academic science into the war effort. He had under him a chemist named James B. Conant, the president of Harvard University, who chaired the National Defense Research Committee. Conant, in turn, had under him a network of divisions, each devoted to a specific class of military problem. Division 17 was the one that mattered to the men in the minefields. It was officially the Optics Division. It was chaired by Professor George R. Harrison, the Dean of Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Within Division 17, a research project labeled CE4, Civil Engineering 4, was assigned in February 1943, the task of finding any way at all to detect mines made of nothing. The team examined every plausible idea. Audio frequency mutual induction with 1 coil, then with 2 coils. Magnetic anomaly detection. Gamma-ray probes. Infrared imaging. None of these were going to find a wooden box buried 2 inches in damp soil. The breakthrough came when the team turned to ultra-high-frequency radio. Any object, they reasoned, has a dielectric constant, a measure of how it stores electrical energy in an electric field. A buried mine, even one made entirely of wood, has a different dielectric constant from the surrounding soil. If you could send a radio wave at a high enough frequency into the ground and listen for the small change in the reflected signal, you might be able to hear a mine that no metal detector could see. It was the conceptual ancestor of what we now call ground-penetrating radar. In 1943, it was something nobody had ever fielded. The contracts to build the device went to several American manufacturers, including the RCA plant in Indianapolis, Indiana, and the Federal Telephone and Radio Corporation. The prototype was completed in late 1943. The production model was called the Detector Set, ANPRS-1. Its technical manual, the United States Army Manual TM 11-1151, was issued on the 15th of April, 1944. The transmitter operated at a frequency between 280 and 320 MHz. The amplifier was carried in a canvas bag on the operator's back. The same M356 resonator and the same HS30 headset that had been used with the older SCR625 plugged directly in, so that an experienced sapper could move from one device to the other without retraining. Tens of thousands of ANPRS-1 sets came off American production lines before the end of the war. They were the first mass-produced ultra-high-frequency mine detectors in history. They were shipped to Italy, to England, and from England across the Channel to France. Every divisional engineer in the European theatre knew, by the late summer of '44, that a new device was coming, a device that could supposedly find the wooden mines. The reality was more complicated than the publicity. The ANPRS-1 worked. After a fashion, it could indeed detect a shoe mine in homogeneous soil that the older detector could not find. But it threw false alarms at almost everything else. The technical manual itself contained the warning that gives the game away. Best results, the manual said, are obtained over regular terrain and homogeneous ground. Numerous false indications are caused by ground irregularities, stones, air pockets, roots of trees, pools of water, and non-uniformity of soil. In other words, the device worked on a flat, sandy field. In the rocky soils of Italy, the flooded meadows of Normandy, the root-tangled forest floor of the Hurtgen, every step generated a tone in the headphones that might be a mine and probably was not. A British liaison report sent back to the Signal Research and Development Establishment in May 1944 was even more direct. The ANPRS-1, it said, had not proved completely satisfactorily. It had serious limitations. It could not even reliably detect the bouncing S-mine, a metal-bodied weapon, if the mine was buried more than 3 inches deep, because the small forward-facing pressure prongs of the S-mine were below the resolving power of the dielectric contrast at depth. The men who used it in the field made their own judgment quickly. In most soils, they preferred the older SCR625 for what it could find, and the steel prod for everything else. The ANPRS-1 was withdrawn from operational service after the war. No equivalent ultra-high-frequency mine detector was fielded by any army for almost 20 years. And yet, here is the strange truth at the heart of this story. The technical solution did not have to be perfect. It only had to be good enough to break the German monopoly on invisibility. The ANPRS-1, for all its flaws, did force the German engineers to keep innovating, to keep adjusting their burial depths and their patterns and their fuse types. It bought time. It saved lives where the soil was right. It taught the next generation of American engineers that the detector and the prod and the trained eye were 3 tools that worked best together, never apart. The men who actually beat the German non-metallic mines in 1944 were not the scientists in Cambridge or the production line workers in Indianapolis, although those people made the work possible. The men who did the work were the engineers of the combat battalions, walking ahead of the rifle companies on every road, every beach, every forest path, with a prod in one hand and a detector in the other, and the knowledge that the next step might be the last. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, demolition teams of the 237th Engineer Combat Battalion landed on Utah Beach with the lead waves of the 4th Infantry Division. Major Herschel E. Lynn commanded the Beach Obstacle Task Force, drawn from the 237th and other units, with the mission of blowing paths through the steel hedgehogs and the wooden ramps and the concrete tetrahedra that Rommel had ordered emplaced along the foreshore. Lynn's landing craft was hit and sank. He survived. Companies A and C of the 237th blew 4 gaps in the seawall behind the beach within the first hour. The executive officer of the battalion, Major R.P. Tabb, came ashore in an M29 Weasel that was swamped in the surf. He climbed out, met Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. on the sand, and within hours had moved his men toward Causeway 2, where a Sherman of the 70th Tank Battalion had struck a mine and was blocking the way inland. By that afternoon, less than a day after the first wave hit the beach, a treadway bridge had been laid across the obstacle and the road was open. In the days that followed, 2 companies of the 238th Engineer Combat Battalion, part of Colonel Thomas Deff, Rogers's 1106th Group, lifted 12,000 American laid mines around Carentan in just 2 days. Those mines had been planted by American paratroopers to protect the flanks of the 101st Airborne. Lifting them opened the road for the link-up of Utah Beach with Omaha Beach and the consolidation of the Allied lodgment. When Operation Cobra broke out of Normandy on the 25th of July, the 1106th and the 1120th Engineer Combat Groups swept the highways, shoulder to shoulder, every available sapper in line, every meter of pavement and shoulder cleared by hand. Without that work, the breakout that ended in the liberation of Paris on the 25th of August 1944 would not have been possible. Then came the autumn and the dark heart of the engineer war on the Western Front. The Hürtgen Forest, 50 square miles of dense pine on the German border south of Aachen, became the killing ground that no American history book wants to remember. The campaign began on the 19th of September, 1944, and dragged on into the middle of December. The forest floor was so thick with mines that some sectors had telemines spaced only a few yards apart. The 15th Engineer Combat Battalion of the 9th Infantry Division, in the opening phase of the battle, lifted 1,352 mines and neutralized 125 concrete pillboxes under direct fire. The 60th Infantry Regiment of the same division suffered almost 100% turnover in combat personnel. The 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division took roughly 300 casualties in the first 3 days of its November attack and went on to lose more than 2,700 men over 18 days, a casualty rate of roughly 85%. The mines did not work alone. German machine gun crews ranged in on the cleared paths so that the men who walked them were caught between the steady rate of mines that had been missed and the steady rate of bullets that had not. Tree bursts of artillery, set off when shells struck the high branches of the pines, sent fragments down on men who could not dig in because the roots of the trees prevented foxholes. By the end of the campaign, total American casualties in the Hürtgen had reached more than 33,000 killed and wounded, and the engineers, unit for unit, took the worst of it. Mine warfare went both ways. American engineers laid German-style minefields against German tanks. On the 19th of December, 1944, in the early days of the Battle of the Bulge, a 25-year-old technician, 4th grade, named Truman Kimbrough, of Company C of the 2nd Engineer Combat Battalion, 2nd Infantry Division, was sent forward as scout for a squad ordered to lay an anti-tank minefield at a road junction outside the Belgian village of Rocherath. The crossroads was already occupied by a German tank and roughly 20 German infantrymen. Kimbrough tried twice to lead his squad to the objective. Both times they were driven back by withering fire. On the third attempt, he left his men in cover and crawled forward alone, his arms full of mines. He was severely wounded as he reached the road. He kept moving. He laid the mines across it. As he tried to crawl back, machine gun fire cut him down. The mines he had set delayed the advance of the German armor and protected the rear of an American withdrawing column. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously the following May. He had been a farmhand from Madisonville, Texas before the war, and he is buried now at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery, in the country he died defending. The engineers also tried, in 1944, every kind of help they could imagine. Some of it worked, some of it failed. The British, on D-Day, fielded the Sherman Crab, a flail tank with chains mounted on a rotating drum at the front that beat the ground in front of the vehicle and detonated mines as it advanced. 3 regiments of the 79th Armored Division landed on Gold, Sword and Juno beaches with these tanks. The Crabs flailed at 1.25 miles per hour, raised columns of dust as they went, and proved especially effective against the Shoe Mine, whose pressure plate was easy to set off with concentrated overhead blows. The American beaches did not receive Crabs in the first wave. The decision had been made to rely on engineers and tank dozers instead. Whether that was the right call became one of the long arguments of post-war military history. There were dogs. The 228th Engineer Mine Detection Company, the first American unit of mine detection dogs, was activated in November 1943. Its handlers and its 100 dogs trained at Fort Belvoir, at the Cat Island War Dog Training Center off the coast of Mississippi, and at Beltsville in Maryland. The War Department's own publicity material had promised that these animals would detect every buried object within a given area, working in daylight or darkness, over any sort of terrain, in any weather. The unit shipped from the United States on the 5th of May, 1944, arrived at Oran on the 30th, and reached Naples in June. In the field tests that followed in Italy, the dogs detected only 30% of the mines they were sent to find. The unit suffered substantial casualties among both dogs and handlers. The 228th was withdrawn from operational service in September 1944 and inactivated in February 1945. The British Royal Engineer dog platoons, formed in April 1944, did somewhat better in northwestern Europe, but their war diaries record the same painful conclusion. In the end, only signs, visible mines, and knowledge of patterns saved handlers from treading on mines. There were improvised tools. British and Canadian sappers in Holland in late 1944 welded steel spikes onto heavy garden rollers, then pushed the rollers ahead of them down suspect roads. An English sapper named Brian Guy, who fought through the Battle of Overloon and Venray that October, later wrote that his unit had to deal with 250,000 mines. The worst of these, he wrote, was the shoe mine, which was made of wood and could not be detected. These mines were causing a continuous stream of casualties with horrific injuries. The garden roller worked, sometimes. So did Bangalore torpedo line charges fired across suspect ground. So did tank dozers grinding up the surface of a road. Every engineer unit in the European theatre had its own improvisations, its own field expedients, its own small tricks of survival passed down from the men who had lived to the men who had just arrived. But more than anything else, what beat the German mines was the human eye. The official post-war reviews are clear and consistent on this point. The single most productive technique for finding a buried mine, on every front of the war, was a trained sapper looking at the ground. A wilted patch of grass, a line of disturbed earth, a pattern of stones that did not quite match the rest of the lane, the grease pencil mark on a tree trunk that a German engineer had left to remind himself where he had buried his charges. The men who survived the longest were the men who learned to read the ground the way a tracker reads a forest, slowly, patiently, never trusting the apparent calm of an empty road. By the end of 1944, the combination of all of these things had begun to win. American and British engineers were lifting hundreds of thousands of mines a month. The countermine schools were turning out trained sappers by the thousand. The ANPRS-1 detector, despite its faults, was in the hands of every engineer battalion that wanted one. The SCR-625 was still in service, still useful where it was useful. The prod, the dog, the flail, the bayonet, the trained eye, all worked together. The Allied armies were moving forward. When the war ended in May 1945, the bill came due. Tens of thousands of German prisoners of war were put to work, clearing the most dangerous fields of Western Europe. France did not finish clearing the coastal Normandy minefields until well into the 1950s. The Eifel National Park in Germany still contains Glasmin 43 fields that have never been swept. Libya, where Rommel had begun his mining campaign in the deserts of 1941 and 42, still has vast tracts of contaminated land. The Red Cross has estimated that a substantial percentage of Libyan farmland remains uncultivable today because of buried mines from the Second World War. The dead from those weapons are still being added to, 80 years after the men who laid them died of old age in their beds. Major General Sir Eustace Tickell, the British Army's engineer-in-chief, told a Ministry of Supply meeting in February 1946 that at present the Army had no answer to the mine problem. A British Signal Research and Development Establishment memorandum that same year described the landmine as having become, by the end of the war, the queen of the battlefield. Both judgments were honest. Detection remained the limiting factor. The men who had lifted the mines of 1944 had not solved the problem. They had only made it possible to keep moving in spite of it. That is the verdict of history on what the engineers of 1944 accomplished. They did not solve the mine problem. 80 years later, no army has solved the mine problem. The technical search for a perfect detector that began with Bush and Conant and Harrison continued through the ANPRS-3, the ANPRS-4, the ANPRS-7, the ANPRS-8, the ANPSS-11 of the Vietnam War, the ANPSS-12 of the Cold War, and the dual-sensor handheld systems used in Iraq and Afghanistan and now in Ukraine. Each generation of engineers has inherited the problem. Each generation has built on what the men of 1944 learned. None of them has finished the job. What the engineers of 1944 did do was bigger than a technical victory. They denied the Germans the result that Rommel had wanted. They got the armies across the beaches. They got the trucks up the roads. They got the wounded back to the aid stations. They paid for that work in lives that nobody back home ever fully counted, because the casualty reports of the United States Army during the Second World War did not break out a separate column for soldiers killed by mines. The men who died, finding the mines that killed the men who walked behind them, are buried in the same cemeteries as everyone else, in the white cross rows of the American Battle Monuments Commission, on the bluff above Omaha Beach where more than 9,000 Americans lie, under the umbrella pines at Nettuno where the dead of Anzio and Cassino rest, in the smaller cemeteries scattered through Belgium and Luxembourg and France and Italy. The story of how it was done is in a single book if you want to read it. The official history of the Corps of Engineers in the war against Germany was published by the Center of Military History in 1985, written by Alfred M. Beck and his team. The chapters on Anzio, on Cassino, on Normandy, on the Hurtgen, on the long winter of 44 are the most heavily footnoted in the entire volume. Every footnote is the trail of a man who was there. Every after-action report cited is an attempt by a tired battalion commander to put on paper what his men had done, while the names of the dead were still fresh in his mind. The book is the record of how an army of citizen engineers, with the help of scientists they would never meet and a Polish lieutenant they had never heard of, beat a weapon that should not have been beatable. The veterans themselves are almost all gone now. Their oral histories, in the plain voices of men who never thought of themselves as heroes, are preserved at the Library of Congress, the National Archives, and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They did not talk much about Dr. Bush or Professor Harrison or the engineers who had built their detectors. Most of them never knew those names. They knew the lieutenant who had walked ahead of them the day before. They knew the sergeant who had taught them how to hold the prod. They knew the corporal whose detector had gone silent at the wrong moment. They knew the small wooden box in the dirt and the sound it made when it was finally lifted clear and laid carefully on the side of the road. That is the quiet truth of the engineer war. The shoe mine and its wooden cousins were not defeated by a single brilliant invention. They were defeated by a million small acts of attention paid by men who knew that their attention was the only thing standing between the rifle company behind them and a road that would not let them pass. The detector was a tool. The dog was a tool. The flail was a tool. The eye and the hand and the discipline of the man on the ground were the weapons that actually defeated the mine. That work was not done in a laboratory in Cambridge, or on a production line in Indianapolis, or in a headquarters in London or a Pentagon office in Washington. It was done on 100,000 square miles of European dirt, one careful step at a time. The names of most of the men who did it belong now to stone markers in cemeteries they never came home from. But the roads they cleared are still there. So are the bridges, and the airfields, and the supply routes that let the rest of the war happen. Every village in Italy that the Allies passed through, every hedgerow in Normandy that the trucks moved past, every forest path in the Hurtgen that the wounded came back along, was made safe by an engineer with a thin steel rod in his hand. The work was not glamorous, and it has never been finished. It was, and remains, the slowest and most patient kind of victory there is. 80 years later, in the soft soil of those same fields, the work that they did is still the reason ordinary people can walk there in peace.